Hello again. Nice to be with you all. Here is Jan from Eastern Europe currently, and we have Dan from Třeboň.
Hello, everybody, and welcome.
And we also have a Bryan Clark, who is a senior fellow and director of the Center for Defense Concept and Technology in Washington. Hello, Bryan. Great to having you.
Thanks, Jan. Great to be here with you and Dan.
You, Bryan, you are a man of many expertise. You served in US Navy, you worked in Pentagon, Department of Defense. Now you are a senior fellow and strategist, not only in military and technology, but in overall international affairs. So it's great to have you to discuss the three important conflicts of today. Everybody now talks about Gaza, and let's start with that. Then we will cover Ukraine, now a little bit lost in a media attention because of Gaza and Israel. And then third conflict in the making that is sort of in the air for years, which is Taiwan versus People's Republic of China. So let me start and to kick off this first question about Gaza and urban warfare. So you as a military strategist, what are the largest obstacles the Israeli army has to cope in the ground operation in Gaza?
Well, the biggest challenge, Jan, is that they are facing an adversary in Hamas that is dug in to a very heavily populated civilian area, right? So Hamas has been living and operating amongst the people. And as a result, they have command centers in places that would not normally be good military targets like hospitals or schools. So the Israelis have been forced to either attack those targets and risk civilian casualties, or they've been forced to go in on the ground and try to root out Hamas room by room, hallway and tunnel by hallway and tunnel, which is a very time-intensive operation. So either you attack in large scale and risk thousands of civilian casualties, which they have done, or you go on the ground like they've started to do most recently and start to identify and find these Hamas troops that are hidden in tunnels that go underneath civilian population centers. So that's really the biggest challenge. Now, Israeli forces have been training for this kind of operation for years. This is not a surprise to them. This is exactly the kind of fight they've expected to have to do against Hamas at some point. The difficulty I think they're facing is the international community may not be as supportive of the type of operation that they're doing right now, which is very heavy on the bombardment and strikes. And then as a result, civilian casualties are mounting. And I think, Israeli troops had maybe trained for an operation that might be much more protracted than maybe international support will allow. Another thing that they've found is that Hamas has done a great job of hiding its weapons caches, hiding where its troops and command centers really are. And so what we've seen is Israeli troops get into a place they think is a command center, like most recently the hospital, the central hospital in Gaza, where they found what they thought was a command center. But there are very few weapons there, very little equipment. And it seems that Hamas has set up even decoy operations where they've got places that the Israelis might think are key targets for them to engage, and only to find out that actually the target is somewhere else and they still have to go look for it. So I think the problem now that the Israeli troops are facing is, even after they complete this operation, have they really rooted out Hamas? Because Hamas may have hidden in places that they didn't expect to have to go, and unless they want to occupy Gaza, like the U.S. had to do in Iraq, for example, for a decade to eventually find all the sympathizers, I think they're going to find that Hamas is still there even after they complete this mission.
When we see pictures from Gaza Strip and all the lot of destroyed buildings around, so how difficult it is for Israeli army to operate in such an environment, and how to eliminate Hamas in such an environment?
Right. I mean, so one of the problems with urban warfare, and this is something the U.S. found in Iraq, is if you mount a strike campaign before you send in the troops, which would make sense, you soften up the enemy and then send in the troops to find the remaining enemies or sympathizers. The problem is now you've destroyed most of the infrastructure, so it's going to be very hard to get around. And the places that you thought were targets you wanted to investigate are now no longer accessible, or you don't know how to access them via the paths that you had mapped out previous to the conflict. So it creates a much more chaotic battlefield. And now the Israeli troops are faced with having to conduct this operation in a very different environment they might have trained for. They've got Hamas troops coming out of places they didn't expect them to come out of. They've got this tunnel network that they've mapped to a degree, but not fully mapped out. And you've got Hamas that has been careful about putting weapons caches and command and control centers in places where Israeli troops have not identified them yet. So they're able to come out of the woodwork and threaten Israeli troops as they make their way through the neighborhoods. So I think the fact that they mounted this large scale strike operation may have been to the detriment of the idea of rooting out Hamas, right? Because you just made it a much more difficult job to figure out where they are and eventually pull them out and pull them away from the population. So I think it's just actually made the troops' job harder rather than making it easier.
Do I hear you correctly that sort of from military point of view, there are similarities between Vietnam and Gaza? So high-end military with top equipment, with great electronic warfare and superiority in the air versus sort of like partisans hiding, decoying.
Yeah, I think it's more similar maybe to Iraq, where you had you had groups that were sympathetic to the Islamic State. They were sympathetic to some of the Ba'athist holdover population in Iraq, and then other terrorist groups in Iraq. Some of which were also proxies of Iran, just like Hamas is. So in Iraq, you had this population that had sort of made their peace with the terrorist groups that were in some ways benefiting them, because groups like the Islamic State were being the government in a lot of areas of Iraq. The other thing about Iraq is that Iraq had the kind of urban centers where U.S. forces had to go in and actually root out these terrorist groups, which the U.S. found was easier to do if you didn't destroy the area first. If you focused on occupation, network building, identifying what the terrorist network looks like, and then going door to door and identifying those people and pulling them out. Now, those operations created a lot of ill will amongst the population, right? Because you had U.S. troops harassing the population, pounding down people's doors, pulling people out of their houses in the middle of the night. That kind of thing is not going to make you very popular. But it's the alternative to doing large scale strike operations and then having to sort out the mess and deal with the civilian casualties that are likely to occur. So I think the U.S. experience in Iraq provides some lessons that might have been applied here in Gaza. And I think Israel just kind of wanted to go in and start the rapid fire artillery and airstrikes in order to get some immediate, action against Hamas that might have been good for the domestic politics in Israel, but maybe were not as good in terms of the actual warfighting effectiveness they were trying to achieve.
We can see in the news that Hamas every day continues with missile strikes to Israel. It is a sign that Hamas is well prepared for the current situation, and it will take. You have already told about it will take maybe years for Israel to combat. So it is this the most difficult part of the conflict?
Yeah, in a lot of ways it will be, because the international support is fading because of the civilian casualties. Israel has conducted pretty much as much strike operations as they can really conduct without further damaging their ability to get the mission objective completed, which is to root out Hamas. So they're forced to do this very kind of long slog of a ground campaign inside of occupied Gaza. And then the question is, well, do you then stay in Gaza for the interim? I mean, you're going to have to occupy for some period to make sure that you actually rooted out all the Hamas fighters and sympathizers. During that entire time, you're going to be faced with Hamas still being able to fight back. For the Israeli government, they're going to have to convince their population that this is the right path, because the population of Israel might want more dramatic action against Hamas. Let's start more airstrikes. Let's go, destroy more parts of the environment there, which is just going to be counter to probably the long-term goal of rooting out Hamas. So it's a conundrum, where you've got to somehow maintain the international support, you've got to maintain the domestic support, and you've got to be able to actually pursue the mission objectives. And they're all somewhat in conflict with each other.
If we move a little bit north from Gaza to Lebanon, so in Lebanon we have Hezbollah, which has been fighting Israel for years. Now Hassan Nasrallah, their the power broker and paramount leader, haven't started any real action yet. Yeah, we see few strikes. We see that Israelis had to evacuate few townships, but still, it's not a second front. So my question is, first, how complicated it would be for IDF to fight on two fronts? And the second, it's connected to you guys. There is a lot of U.S. muscles in Eastern Mediterranean, carry a strike group, and you, as a former naval officer, what's the deployability, not only as a deterrence, but real deployability of American Navy, U.S. Navy against Hezbollah if needed?
Yeah, so the challenge, I think, for Israel is resisting the urge to create a second front. I think the IDF, you could deploy to both locations. I mean, the troops that are working in Hamas right now, really, that could be much more of a traditional ground operation, where you're putting a lot of forces at play to do a counterinsurgency operation and root out a terrorist group. Up in the north against Hezbollah, this could be much more of an air operation where you're doing airstrikes, responsive attacks against Hezbollah troops that are shooting at you. So they would not need to go occupy southern Lebanon, which didn't go well the last time they tried to do that. But instead, they could just focus on essentially tit for tat exchanges and keeping that from turning into a larger conflict. But that'll stretch them pretty thin. I think where the U.S. Navy and the U.S. military could come into play is they have been already doing air and missile defense in support of Israel. So the U.S. ships have intercepted several missiles shot by Houthis in Yemen to try to escalate the conflict by attacking southern Israel. And this is all at Iran's behest, right? So Iran is using these groups to pressure Israel on multiple fronts, south, and then in the Gaza Strip, and then also in the north, as well as in the West Bank. So they're getting it from all sides. I think Iran is trying to provoke a reaction from Israel that will then, tip the scales in terms of the Middle East power dynamics. But in any event, with Hezbollah, it's unlikely that U.S. forces would be able to conduct or would be used to conduct direct strikes against Hezbollah. That's probably a bridge too far. But they could help with the air and missile defense, to protect against those rocket attacks coming in from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And they could free up Israeli air defenses that might otherwise be protecting Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. So they could use aircraft and ships to help back up that capacity so that the Israeli Defense Force can put more air defenses, including airplanes, up in the north to respond to these Hezbollah attacks.
You talked about declining support for Israel from the international society. So my last question to Israel would be, just today, Czech president and retired army general Petr Pavel declared that this conflict has a potential to develop into a more large conflict, maybe global conflict. Do you agree with him? It has any potential in it, or is it a little bit different?
I mean, I think it could develop into a larger conflict, certainly, if it's not handled well, right? You could see a situation where Israel attacks Iran directly, to try to force Iran to back down, because really it's Iranian support that's driving a lot of these groups to be able to do what they do. And that would then bring Iran directly into the fight. That might cause countries that are on the sidelines right now to side against Israel. And you could end up with a larger Middle Eastern fight. I still think the countries that are Iranians support, for example, Russia, China, are all providing money and in some cases arms to Iran. I don't think they're going to come in on a military sense and help Iran if there's a war over this conflict in the Middle East. But I do think it means that you could end up with a wider war where Israel's fighting Iran directly, and then countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar and others have to choose sides. And that could prompt a wider war, and that might prompt some international intervention, but maybe not an international conflict. Like I don't see the U.S. and Russia or U.S. and China coming to blows over this, but I do see them maybe sending peacekeepers in to try to calm things down once Israel and Iran have gotten into a direct conflict.
If we now move to the second topic of today's conversation, which is Ukraine. The war in Ukraine goes on for almost 2 years. It's a very bloody war on both sides. It's a sort of attritional warfare. From the perspective of land grabs, nothing too much happened in 2023. It's a sort of stalemate with both sides sitting in the trenches and fighting and shooting at each other with whatever they have. So how would you describe militarily the current situation on the battlefield?
Yeah, it is a very static situation. So you see a little bit of movement back and forth, mostly the Ukrainians gaining a little bit of ground at a time against the Russians, but it's pretty much it's a static line at this point. And in a lot of ways, that's driven because both sides have fortified that line to a pretty deep degree. So you've got multiple on the Russian side, multiple kilometers of hardened fortifications, as well as minefields, and then backed up by artillery and missile defenses. So for the Ukrainians to make progress, they're going to have to cut their way through kilometers of defenses. But by the same token, the Russians can't really gain ground, right? So if you build up a wall, it's hard to then jump over that wall and try to take ground away from the Ukrainians. And so the construct of the front lines in a lot of ways is driving this static nature of the conflict. The other thing that's driving it, and this is something that recently General Zelensky wrote about in The Economist, was the lack of the game-changing technology, a capability that might enable the Ukrainians to be able to break through those front lines. And that really comes down to air power. It really comes down to the ability to use aircraft to suppress enemy air defenses, which is something that NATO would do. So if NATO were fighting this war, NATO would use electronic warfare aircraft to attack the air defenses of the Russians, and then attack those with missiles and kinetic capabilities, and then eventually start rolling back Russia's defensive lines using air power. Ukraine doesn't have that ability right now because they're just now getting F-16s. The F-16s are not integrated with most of the long-range weapons that the Ukrainians have, like the Storm Shadow and the Scalp are not able to integrate on the F-16 right away. They're usable by the MiG-29, which the Ukrainians have a small number of and don't want to risk in combat. So that's leaving them in this sort of situation where the air power they have is not valuable or useful in breaking through the lines. And the air power they need, which is more like electronic warfare aircraft or long-range weapons that can integrate on the F-16, are not yet available to them. And so I think that's why you're going to see this static nature of the line continue, because both sides have fortified it to the point where it's almost impossible to make a quick movement except through the air.
When you are talking about technology, so there's a lot of talk about military equipment, and President Zelensky repeatedly and frequently asked its Western partners to deliver more military equipment. But if I see it in the right way, there could be, in a very short time, Ukraine is becoming short of soldiers, maybe, because there are a lot of Ukrainian people in the Europe. Only in Germany there are about 300 Ukrainian men in the age between 18 and 60. So could this be the most difficult problem for Ukraine in this war?
It could be. I think the manpower limitations that Ukraine faces are probably going to become more of a challenge here in the next year or two. The key, which I think gets to General Zelensky's remarks, which is that we need a game-changing technology to break through that doesn't require large numbers of people. So I think when he talks about that, he's talking about air power, electronic warfare, long-range missiles. Those are the kinds of capabilities that can help push the Russians back, and they don't require a large number of people. So we have to go from, kind of the, as you said, attritional warfare that's happening on the front lines now, which is artillery barrages and rocket barrages, followed by, troops trying to occupy territory. We have to shift from that to more like how NATO would fight this fight, which is air power followed by maneuvering to quickly gain territory and push your adversary out, without having to bring enormous numbers of troops to bear. Because I think they kind of go together in that the kind of fighting that Ukraine needs to take on to be able to succeed is also the kind of fighting that limits the number of people they need. And so I think those two things go together. Even if Ukraine had an infinite number of people, they would not be able to break through the lines without some new technology being brought to bear.
When I continue this question, so what would be needed for real breakthrough, if it's even possible, and both from equipment and soldiers' perspective?
Right. I think so. One thing right off the bat is the Taurus missile, which Germany had previously pledged to Ukraine, is integratable on the F-16. So the Spanish have used the Taurus missile with the F-16. So you can put those two things together. If they had Taurus missiles, of which there's hundreds available in inventory, that would allow them to mount some longer range attacks at scale. That they'd be able to use against Russian logistics nodes, command and control centers, their air defense systems, and that would allow then Ukrainian troops to be able to move with some level of air superiority. The other thing is electronic warfare systems. So right now, NATO places a high priority on what we call suppression of enemy air defenses, or SEAD, electronic warfare systems that are on platforms like the Eurofighter electronic warfare variant, the US Growler E-18G electronic warfare aircraft. Those aircraft are designed to suppress enemy air defenses, and so they're designed to jam them, confuse them, take them out of the fight, and then they can be attacked with anti-radiation missiles. So those capabilities would really allow the Ukrainians to be able to break the Russians' hold on the airspace over the front lines. And then Ukraine could use a combination of helicopters as well as their ground troops to start breaking through. But I think absent like mid-level, which is like 5,000 to 20,000 feet air superiority, Ukraine's not going to be able to break through those front lines. They've got to be able to take to the air to either move the troops over or to take out the defenses that are keeping them from being able to move more quickly. I would say another area where Ukraine could probably benefit more is continued supply of more capable, longer range drones. Some of the like suicide drones. So you've seen Russia with the Shahed 136s have a lot of success until recently with attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure. Now, Ukraine has been using electronic warfare systems, like the Prokhorova system, to jam the satellite navigation of those drones, and they're being less successful now. But going forward, Ukraine probably could benefit from having drones that are more capable of defeating satellite navigation jamming, because the Russians do a lot of that as well. And so if they were able to get systems like the Altius 600 or the Coyote system the U.S. has, or some of these longer range drones that the U.S. and NATO have in inventory, some of which have artificial intelligence software that allows them to navigate even when they're being jammed. So even if they can't tell what the GPS thinks, their artificial intelligence software can allow them to predict where they are based on other indicators like radio antennas, listening to where the radio emissions I'm hearing in the area. How does that correlate with what I would expect in the real world? So they can use that to navigate even if they're being jammed in terms of GPS. So those capabilities will allow them to mount larger scale attacks against Russian troops to start to back off, the Russians on the front lines. So I kind of feel like it's all about getting air superiority, and it's all about delivering firepower through the air. If that's the only way that I think Ukraine's going to be able to break out. And to Dan's point, if you don't do that, you're going to still be dependent on large numbers of troops to mount this operation, and you will eventually run out.
We're talking about Ukrainian perspectives, but there is the other side. So Russia. Russia has nuclear weapons in its military equipment. So shall we be afraid that Russia will be maybe pushed to use it in the future?
I don't think so. I think at this point, Russia has a pretty good hand. I mean, I think if Ukraine were to get new capabilities that allows them to break through, Russia would then be able to negotiate some kind of settlement. I think that Russia is not going to come to the negotiating table until they see themselves losing ground, and the potential exists for them to get entirely pushed out of the country. So they could then seek some kind of frozen conflict, or at least a ceasefire. So they've got lots of options that prevent them from having to escalate, with like a nuclear weapon. And I think also a nuclear weapon, would come across, obviously it has a lot of destructive power and cause lots of casualties, but it would also come across as weak, so it would seem like, Putin is really using as weapons of last resort, which for his population would sort of imply that he's lost it. He's not able to continue the operation in traditional ways, so he's having to turn to kind of this break glass capability. I think it would in the end undermine his authority and credibility. So I think the Russians have a pretty good position right now and are likely to wait to see if Ukraine's able to actually start pushing them back, and then they got the option of trying to negotiate some kind of arrangement, and trade some land for a ceasefire. But I think that we're kind of past the point where Russia was at risk of kind of completely collapsing. I think that was the risk maybe a year ago or a year and a half ago, when it looked like Russia might completely collapse and fall back to Russia's borders. And in that case, a rapid collapse like that could perpetuate or could drive Putin to maybe mount something much more escalatory. But now I think it's going to be a much more incremental operation where he can shape the message in a way that doesn't seem as bad, and he's able to negotiate a settlement that they can call a victory.
Is there any possibility that Russia could change it and really get any breakthrough from its side?
Right. It seems like it seems unlikely. So the reason that it seems unlikely is because Russia has sort of used all of its tools, right? So they've used their air power, they've used their long-range missiles, they've even used their hypersonic weapons. They are being much more successful now with their drone warfare, although I think systems like Pokrova are going to dampen that success. So I think Russia has pretty much pulled out all the stops in terms of what they have on a conventional side, so short of nuclear weapons. And they're finding that it's just not up to snuff. They're suffering large losses in the naval arena, with what happening to the Black Sea Fleet due to drone attacks. So I feel like they've done everything they can do to try to break through, and now it's going to be just a matter of waiting out the West. I think that's kind of their strategy right now, is let's wait out the West, see if the support falters and it drives Ukraine to the negotiating table, and they're able to get better terms from Ukraine, or they can just wait it out and then just start the war again in the spring. So I think if Ukraine's able to start pushing back, and maybe even during this winter start pushing back, that would force Russia to actually negotiate, as opposed to just sitting and waiting to start the next phase of the offensive.
So maybe I think with this, let's move to the topic number 3, which is Taiwan. A lot of people are talking about invasion. Some people talks about it, it's not in PLA's interest to do direct invasion than to go through the strait, but more choking. So basically, militarily, do you think that for current People's Liberation Army of China, is Taiwan within the reach? It's possible to take it by military action?
So I think, yes, I mean, they could take it by military action, because you think about, you've got a country of 1.3 billion people next to a country of 60 million, so I guess 40 million now. But so there's a huge size disparity. There's a huge amphibious lift disparity. I mean, I just think that what we've seen is that if China really wanted to invade Taiwan, they could, but at large cost. And it could be very protracted, because China does not necessarily have the ability to quickly get those troops across the strait. So it could be very prolonged. They could suffer a lot of losses along the way. And the question for Xi and the Central Military Commission is, are you in a position to be able to mount that operation at acceptable risk? And so the idea would be, can we drive down? They are trying to drive down the risk, and they're trying to increase for Taiwan the uncertainty of China's actions, so that they forced Taiwan to be more, either supportive of China, less independently minded, or more willing to go along with China's one China policy and eventually reach some kind of unification scheme. So China, this is all about posturing China for its relationship with Taiwan. So when they threaten invasion, it's really about the elections that are coming up early next year, where you've got the DPP party talking about independence, talking about trying to become a separate country, and China doesn't like that, so they start rattling their saber in the hopes that the more more friendly party to them is going to come into power.
There is a lot of analysis of the strength of People's Liberated Army. But the last military conflict where China was involved in was Sino-Vietnamese War in 1979. So it is more than 40 years ago. So is there any possibility we can consider what is the real military strength of the Chinese army?
Well, I think, so the Chinese army is, as you said, the last time they were tested, they didn't perform well. They've not been tested since then, really. They have, modest operational experience and, zero combat experience. So you're right. I think in a lot of ways they would not be effective initially, in a conflict because there's a lot of chaos and fog and friction and war that you're not ready for if you've never experienced that before. I think the thing to keep in mind though is the China-Vietnam conflict was not an existential conflict for China. That was a small scale conflict that they mounted in the hopes of tamping down the independence-minded people of North Vietnam. So that was intended to kind of be a limited action, and then once it started to go badly, they got themselves out of it. Taiwan, on the other hand, is existential for China. So it's a core interest. If Xi and the Central Military Commission mounted an invasion, they would feel compelled to turn it into a victory in some way. So either they're going to pour whatever resources are necessary into it to make it a victory, or reframe the terms of the metrics to be able to say it's a victory in the end. But I mean, you think about just the size of the Chinese military and the size of the Chinese shipping fleet. They should be able to eventually, bring enough troops and material over to occupy Taiwan and bring it to heel. But like I said, it's going to be at great cost potentially, and potentially very protracted, and potentially very unpopular at home. And that could be, that's a problem in China where you've got a one-party system and there's no outlet for people to express their unhappiness with the government. So the leadership is going to be concerned about anything that creates a lot of instability in the country, which might result in some kind of revolution or some kind of overthrow of the existing party. So that's why they're trying to balance their rhetoric about Taiwan with an understanding of what's realistic in terms of the party staying in power if there was a conflict. But they want to be able to rattle the saber enough to drive the politics in Taiwan towards a more or less independently minded, more conciliatory direction.
I have exactly the same question, but from the other side of the strait. So if we put aside a water, and the strait is a big deterrent, so we know that there is less water between continental Europe and Britain, and it prevented both Napoleon and Hitler to jump to London, to take London. Here there is more miles between the mainland and Taiwan. But putting this aside, what are the current top strengths of Taiwanese military, and basically how you think that they will defend themselves if needed?
Right. So I think Taiwan has their military capability is improving. They recently launched their first indigenously developed submarine, for example. But it's a small military. I mean, it's a small country with a military that's in the, I believe, 60,000 people range. So you're talking about a military on the whole that's the size of the U.S. Coast Guard, or the size of a little bit bigger than the New York City Police Department. So it's not a huge military. So even if it's relatively capable, and it's getting more capable, it's still just not going to have the capacity to go up against China alone in a confrontation. And I think what the Chinese are looking at is, can they bully Taiwan into a more conciliatory stance regarding unification, rather than having to mount an operation that's going to be damaging economically. And so that's why you've seen a lot of signaling, a lot of shows of force, and temporary blockades and harassment, but not as much in terms of real military action on the part of China. Because I think they feel like if they can continue to ramp up this harassment campaign, it puts Taiwan in the position of understanding how precarious its situation is, and the people will be less likely to vote in a party that's going to advocate for independence. So it's all about the kind of messaging and the political warfare, if you will, rather than the hardcore military warfare. But from Taiwan's perspective, their military is transitioning to be more focused on countering an invasion. And for a long time, they were focused on trying to be a more traditional military. But now I think they recognize the threat of invasion as such that they probably need to focus their attentions there, which means shifting from buying traditional aircraft and ships to ships that are more designed to be used in a counter blockade, counter invasion context. So smaller ships with more anti-ship weapons. Instead of traditional aircraft like F-16s, maybe more drones, that you might be able to use to actually go up against bombers or go up against ships that are attacking you. So you're seeing that transition happen now, but it's happening relatively slowly. And I think that's because Taiwan is wrestling with the idea that maybe people don't want to join the military if it's going to be just sitting in a bunker waiting for a fight with China. And also because they prefer to have a more traditional relationship with their other allies rather than being seen as strictly a fortress that protects the Philippine Sea from Chinese forces coming into the open ocean. So I think that there's a lot of things in balance there in terms of how Taiwan has been developing its military, but it has to do with this idea of looking at wanting to be a traditional player versus its geographic and geopolitical position as basically the first line of defense against China.
So let's imagine there is an invasion of China into Taiwan. So what could we expect from the United States? How would we behave in this situation?
Well, so the United States would come to the defense of Taiwan. I think that's pretty straightforward, pretty clear. There's a lot of U.S. forces that are in the region that would be tangled up in it in one way or another. So it's almost impossible for them to avoid it. China, because it's going to want to lower the risk of an operation like an invasion, is going to have to attack U.S. and probably Japanese bases and forces at the outset to keep them out of the fight. It can't wait to see if they're going to join in. And so I think that's going to bring Japan and the U.S. into the fight immediately. And then you'll be into the U.S. is probably going to try to use long-range missile attacks to slow down the invasion or stop it, but mostly slow it down. And then Taiwan will focus on trying to combat the invaders as they're approaching the shore and turn it into a ground slog. And so I think one thing that Taiwan's looking at is Ukraine and saying, can we turn the fight over Taiwan into a fight like you see in Ukraine, where Russia bogged down, and now you see a stalemate that China, a stalemate like what you see in Ukraine would be very problematic for China because it doesn't necessarily have the political support for the current regime that they do in Russia, even though obviously Putin is a dictator just like Xi is. The difference might be that in Xi's case, you've got a much more energized population that's much more educated, much more interested in economic development. Those things are on the wane, and then if we've got an expensive and costly both in lives and money war in Taiwan happening, those people will probably try to seek some reform and change in the regime, if not outright ouster of the people of the party, rather removal of some of the people. And so all that weighs on the decision making of the Central Military Commission and whether to mount an invasion of do we really want to get bogged down on the ground in Taiwan like the Russians have been bogged down in Ukraine. So that's what Taiwan would try to do, is create a stalemate like you see in Ukraine today. And the U.S. will focus mostly on doing long-range attacks until they can get closer to the fight to be able to better support Taiwan.
If we move a little bit to the different possible scenario, last year during Nancy Pelosi's visits to Taipei, China tested different strategy, not invasion, but cutting Taiwan off the road, sort of like choking it. No plane landed in Taipei, no ship was allowed because of military drills. So this was sort of like Cuban blockade reversed back from the 60s. So how is it possible to defend yourself against such a scenario? And do you think that it's plausible to think that this is going to be Chinese strategy?
Yeah, so in the work we've done, the research we've done, and the reports we've written, we focused on this scenario, the quarantine scenario, as being probably the most likely one that China would mount because it has less risk, than an invasion. It's also more scalable. An invasion, once you've started, it's kind of something that has to continue until you have an off ramp presented to you. But of a quarantine, you can dial it up or dial it down depending on the relationship between the countries and also kind of what your objectives are. So you could see China choosing to mount this kind of quarantine where they say U.S. support to Taiwan is destabilizing the region. Therefore, we would like to stop U.S. arms shipments to Taiwan, and we're going to inspect vessels coming to Taiwan to ensure that they're not bringing in destabilizing weapons or troops, or U.S. advisors or U.S. trainers. That they can see that as all being very destabilizing, just like we did with Cuba receiving support from the Soviet Union. So you could see that being a path they could take. Now the downside for China is that exerts an economic cost on China too, because China is enormously dependent upon the semiconductors and some of the other electronics equipment that comes out of Taiwan, and they don't have that internally yet in China. So China's supply chains depend on Taiwan to a great degree. And although maybe shipments can continue out of Taiwan into China, still the raw materials have to come into Taiwan. And so a quarantine that starts to affect the Taiwanese supply chain eventually, or actually very quickly, affects the Chinese supply chain, especially for very high value goods. China depends on sales of iPhones and TVs and things like that to the West. And if they quarantine Taiwan, that has a direct impact on those supply chains. The other thing is the international community would probably react, right? There would probably be economic sanctions imposed on China as a result of a quarantine of Taiwan. And those could be they could be targeted very effectively. They could be fairly debilitating. The ones that were placed against Russia were fairly effective, but there's a whole different set of tools that China is vulnerable to because it's much more intricately entangled in the financial system, much more so than Russia was. So you could certainly see China being having to pay a cost in terms of its own economy if it were to mount a quarantine, and that's something that the leaders are going to have to weigh, is to say, do the benefits of this, keeping Taiwan from becoming more independent, or do they outweigh the cost associated with our economy suffering more and our people continuing to question the bargain they've made with the leadership that they're going to accept autarky, or rather autocracy, in exchange for economic development. They're going to start questioning that if the economic development fails to manifest itself.
Yeah, 30% of world goods is produced in China. So China is really highly integrated in the world economy. But when we see what's going on the Chinese political scene, especially the Xi and his power, his increasing power, and expansion of China in Africa and in the Middle East, so to what extent is the China a geopolitical threat for the future?
I'd say China definitely is a geopolitical threat, and partly because of its military capability. But their military capabilities are still very much focused on the Western Pacific. So if you look at China's military, it's not designed for power projection. Really, I mean, they've got a aircraft carrier, and they've got some longer range amphibious and surface combatant ships. But still, it's a relatively small force that can do an overseas operation. So it's really designed mostly to protect Chinese interests in the near seas, or the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and maybe the Philippine Sea. So I think what is more of a threat is China's kind of mercantilist approach to its relationships with countries in Africa and South America, where they throw money around, get influence, and then can cause those countries to be less supportive of U.S. or Western interests, and more challenging for U.S. and Western companies to work with. Right, so China attempts to take those off the playing board and bring them into China's orbit, at least politically or economically. Even if militarily, they're not really a good launching pad for Chinese operations because they just lack that power projection capacity. And so I think that's the challenge that the U.S. and the West is faced with, is, you have to contain China's military ambitions in the Western Pacific while also countering, probably through similar economic development efforts, their efforts in the global South, to try to become the partner of choice, for countries in Africa and South America.
And I think that's it. Thank you for being with us, Bryan. Excellent insights, excellent interview, and all the best to Virginia.
Thank you. Great to talk to you, Jan. Great to talk to you, Dan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Goodbye.